you for now, and then we'll, of course, unmute later. And I might have to click to let people join. So thank you very much for joining. Hopefully, we might even get some more people. As I put in my description email and in my posts on Instagram, I just thought it'd be nice to be able to have some sort of conversations about photography and photo topics during this time of being sheltering in place. And so I had this idea for Kai's photo topics. And since I'm Kai, that makes sense why I'm hosting this. For the first one, I thought it'd be nice to look at a photographer who I've long admired since the 90s and a book that I fell in love with and absolutely wanted to sort of share with people. I know a lot of people haven't actually had the physical copy of this book in their hand because it's rare enough. So I thought that might be a nice, fun topic to start with. So the format that I imagined for this was just a very short kind of show and tell, certainly not trying to be some sort of detailed, historically accurate, technical or talk, but just from an enthusiastic point of view of, here's something I think is nice and important and worth sharing. And then I'll do about a 10 to 15 minute presentation on that, today being the book of Josef Sudek. And then from there, just open it up and, everyone can chime in with not necessarily questions for me, but things and reflections or something you might think about. I know at least, like I said, we've got at least one photographer here who's works primarily in panoramics, so that might be interesting to hear from Dennis. And have Rob Steinberg, who joined, who, as I'm going to say, is the one who turned me on to Sudek in the first place, and also traveled in Czechoslovakia back before the Iron Curtain fell, and has some maybe some stories from trying to search out Sudek's work back then too, which might be interesting. I'm just letting a couple more people in. All right. So as we're joining in, I'm going to start sharing my screen in a minute. I thought I'd just do like a 10 or 15 minute presentation, a little bit about Sudek himself for those who are not as familiar. And then, of course, selections from this great book, which has his name on the side, but otherwise kind of enigmatic cover with this beautiful design, which is Prague panoramic pictures, or Praha Panoramatická. I'm not sure exactly how the Czech pronunciation of that would be. So get started, and then if you just want to make a note of any questions or things you want to bring up, maybe at the end when I stop sharing my screen, then we could go into a discussion at that point. So I'm going to start in with sharing. And my buddy Lightroom. So this is probably the most reproduced photograph I ever found of Sudek. It's sort of like the heroic kind of picture of him in a way, there with his large format camera, and isn't always immediately obvious to everyone when they first see this photograph, but is usually talked about as the fact that this is not a coincidence that his jacket is sort of falling this way, is that he actually only does have one arm. And so that's part of the kind of lore behind him as well. And one reason I often bring him up to students when they're complaining about a difficulty in a photo project they were working on, where, oh, I'd have to get up early in the morning, or I'd have to go do this, or I'd have to go do that. I'd always bring up the idea of imagine Sudek, one arm with this huge, large format camera and tripod and film holders, crawling around early in the morning and all over Prague and the area. So he certainly was a hard worker and got an incredible amount done during his lifetime. But I'd start out with just a little bit of biographical information. Some of it I learned from, there's a Charles Sawyer article about Sudek that was published in Creative Camera magazine back in the 80s, and it's also online. You can find it, and you can get a little bit more information about him. He was born in 1896, which was in Bohemia. It was before Czechoslovakia. It was more thinking about the Hungarian Empire, and he was born there 1896, and he was going into the army in 1915, and he was on the Italian front fighting in Italy, and that's where he was wounded in his right arm. They sort of dragged him off to a peasant house somewhere, and he was sitting there for days, sort of waiting for medical help, and developed gangrene in that right arm, which is why, even though the wound wasn't that major, they wound up taking his right arm off just because the gangrene was spreading. And while he was resting up in the hospital, he decided to start photographing his fellow uh, people in the hospital. He had been apprenticed to a bookmaker, a bookbinder before then. So he had this whole idea that he was going to be, spending his life binding up books, which I think is kind of interesting in terms of the way this book looks. Maybe there's something to the details in this book from his background. But losing the arm was sort of the end to that dream. So he started photographing then. And the other photographs that I found of him were these ones that Charles Sawyer had in this article. And more towards the end of his life. I think these are from 1976, the last kind of photo gallery opening he had. This is in the office of the gallery. This is a photograph of him in his studio, which, if you look through some of his books, especially the Sonia Bellotti book, his studio was kind of this crazy mess with papers and stuff everywhere. Who knows how he found everything, but it's kind of an incredible space to work in. And this is another photograph of him by Charles Sawyer in his studio. And I wanted to point out on the table here is this other lovely book, which is printed the same way as this Prague Panoramic book. And if you have a chance to see that book, I also recommend it. I found someone who was cutting pages out of this book and selling individual pages on eBay as like photographs, which was really drove me nuts. But they're that gorgeous, the reproductions inside the book. So this is the book we're going to talk about today, which is, as I said, the Prague Panoramic book. It came out in 1959. And just everything about this book is beautifully done. I mean, this typeface, of course, the printing, which I'm going to get to in a second, but it's just a beautiful object and it makes you want to pick it up. And like I said, it has this kind of crazy cover with this design. Reminds me a little bit of another book that I just forgot anyways. And it has a end pages. This is the first photograph in the book, this little statue, and you'll see at the end there's another little statue picture at the very end. And here is one of my favorite photographs from the book, and I thought we would just see that for a second, just as the kind of incredible light and the range and this 1:3 panoramic format that he was working in. I'll be zooming into this one later, but just to start off. So what was he using to make these pictures? Because for a lot of his work is all done with a big, large format camera, like I said, and plate carrying this thing around. But these all in this book were made with a Kodak camera, which I'm going to show you in a second. But the reproductions in this book are all rotogravure. So unlike another copy of this book I'm going to show you later, which is offset printing, this uses this rotogravure process, which the drum actually gets etched like in lithography, and etched like in engravings, and then the ink gets stuck in the little pockets and gets pushed onto the page as the sheet goes through. And if you look at this, I zoomed in and with a loop on a section of these pages, you can see it looks almost more like film grain. If I zoom in here, you can see there is a regular pattern of some sort, but when we compare it to an offset printed page later, you can see it's much more of like a continuous tone image, which has something to do with how beautiful the reproductions are in this book. And the check printing at the time, the rotogravure, is just all gorgeous. This is the camera he was using. Kodak made several of these panoramic cameras, so I'm not sure if he was using number 1 or number 4. But the interesting thing about them is it produces this 1:3 format, but it's the lens tilts. So here's someone using it. If you see the lens down here, that's sort of tucked away. That swings around as the photograph is made, and it swings around this rounded back, and that gives you this incredible 140-degree view of things. So if you look at the way this railing, the way the railing is going in this photograph, that distortion is because of the lens swinging through. And so that's another thing that he sort of anticipated. There's a lot of multiple perspectives coming through in these, as opposed to, a still lens version of a panoramic camera, which wouldn't give you these multiple perspectives. There's many photographs like this in the book of these, beautiful, intense buildings in Prague, and even did some like street life stuff. You can see this guy over here seems to be looking out at him. But for the most part, uh, it's these more bucolic scenes of areas around Prague. A lot of photographs, of course, of the river and the bridges. And he did a lot of things in the editing in the book where there'll be two photographs like these next to each other, which are from the same area. So it's almost like a continuation of the panoramic in a way, which is kind of interesting. Uh, the book is very physical in the layout and the way that one sort of bleeds across to the other. And a lot of stuff is outside in these sort of, intense scenes, you know, sort of incredible light everywhere. And he really made good use of this distortion. Um, if we see the way that, sorry, I had to admit somebody else in the participant. If we see the way that he sort of planned these out with these people on the edge here, knowing the way this arch of the bridge would go, just pretty incredible. But there's also these places out in the countryside that are not, overly dramatic, not the, beautiful Prague cityscape with all of the majestic buildings, these kind of more humble scenes. And some of them, like this, kind of blow me away. I love kind of the round heads of these people against, I assume, is like a water tank of some sort. It's just, and the light and the way that sort of gets foggy off in the background is kind of incredible and beautiful in all of these. Another one of my personal favorites, and I'll compare this in the other book. There's a couple of them with laundry on the line and this light coming through, and just uh, the real sense of place. I think one of the challenges with making panoramic photographs is that it's not just cropping another rectangle down. You really have to think about, how this is going to play out in this long uh, format, and how all these elements are going to play together. Some things just don't work as panoramic photographs. And I think he really, over the years using this camera, he certainly mastered that. Each one of these, you feel like he got just the right spot for everything to fall together. Love these people swimming here. And then towards the end of the book, this sort of shocking thing happens as you flip the book and all of a sudden it's on its side. He did a number of these verticals, and I'll now rotate that one. I didn't put a lot of these in just because it's a little disorienting and you can't see as much in on the screen, shared on the screen. But check out a photograph like this, where the top of the photograph, you're actually looking up under this tree because of that 140-degree angle of the lens zooming around. And then you come down and now you're, level with the ground. And it's pretty incredible. Here's another one that's like that, where those trees all coming from the side are like lightning or something. Just pretty insane. This is the last picture in the book. The other the bookend for that one of the sort of smiling woman at the beginning. And then I also wanted to show that they, 1959, they used Roman numerals for everything. So this is the list of plates, and you can see they stuck with the Roman numerals all the way through. It's kind of wild. So the other description I want to show is how this is the 1959 version, but there is this 1992 Odeon press version that is printed duotone offset. And when I was looking for a copy of this book, the 1959 version at the time was going for like $1,500, $2,000, but you could get this 1992 version for only like $100 sometimes, or 75. And again, if this is the rotogravure printing, this is what the duotone offset printing looks like. Although you can't really see the duotone color too much in these two, but it's much more of that kind of dot pattern, right? And that's not the only reason that the quality isn't as good, but you can just see the reproductions are just not nearly the same. That's the rotogravure at the top, and the kind of washed out version in the 1992 edition. I mean, they got more detail in the 3/4 tones and stuff like that, but they just lost all of the drama. I mean, it's just totally flat. I mean, just throughout the entire book. If you were to only see this 1992 version, there's the other comparison. You'd think, okay, these are beautifully framed and all that, but you just would not get nearly the sense of, that kind of like majestic light and everything that he managed to get. So if you can, I highly, highly recommend trying to look at the 1959 version. So those are the plates that I thought would be interesting to look at, and that's the book. So in the interest of doing the short format of this, I'll stop my talking and presentation, hold up 2 copies of the book. There we go. And open it up for whoever wants to talk about it. So you'll have to unmute yourself because I did mute everyone. And let's see what we have to say. We've got, 10 more minutes we can talk.
Have you used that camera yourself that he used?
I've not. I've used several, like 1x3, like the Panorama, and another like medium format one, but none of. I have a Russian one with the swinging lens, but I don't have it working yet, so I haven't played with that. I know Dennis Santella, who looks like he's not on anymore.
No, I'm here.
Oh, you are okay. Dennis, you used a camera that rotated in a different way, but had a swinging lens and a different kind of turret, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one I used most recently was one of those sights, 120, 220 cameras that both the camera and the film rotate at the same time. So it's kind of similar. And
yeah, and you had to learn how to anticipate that thing, right? Where it was going to.
Yeah, no, especially like I was also using it where I was moving the camera while I was taking the picture. So it's even more of like a visual spatial problem.
Mm-hmm. Who else? Oh, Rob, how about you? You're on mute. You got to unmute yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
How about now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Circuit camera was more common for Panorama, which did the clockwork mechanism just to rotate the camera around an optical center. So Sudek stuff really had a much different sense of perspective than you got with circuit. And I don't know if anybody else who was of that talent who used that camera. I think he stood out. Do you know of anybody else?
I don't, and it looks like they made it from 1899 to 1924 and then just abandoned the format. So, and yeah, they're kind of rare. And I can't think of another person who made that good use of, like those vertical ones, especially anticipating that field of view is just amazing.
And what film did it take? Did it take standard 126 or something, or?
Yeah, and he was able to get film from AGFA for it. Let's see, AGFA Photo Technical C, a FOMA Ultrapan he used, and an Ilford HP, not HP5, but just HP. And it was it's 3.5 by 12 inches, the full format. I think you only get 4 frames, and so yeah, it's a roll film camera that he was able to get those for back then. It's probably, and the camera only had 2 settings. Slow and fast, basically. So there's only 2 exposures that were possible, and yet if you look, he used it in a wide variety of snowy, low light, everything, just incredible.
So the only thing I wanted to add, I was in Czechia for a bit over a month in '85 when it was still behind the Iron Curtain, and I went there with suitcases full of contraband to trade. Cartons of cigarettes and all kinds of goodies, a Rolly camera. And to give you a sense of value then, a shitty Pentax, I think K1000 or whatever the bottom end of a Pentax line was. There's one used camera store in Prague, and they had one Pentax for sale used, and it was about $1,000 at the exchange rate. And the average wage of a middle-class Czech was between $250 and $400 a month. So it was between 3 and 4 months' wages for used Pentax. The other thing that was extraordinary is there are cameras everywhere. Just like now in the US, you couldn't move without being photographed. So people were fearful. But and they wouldn't speak to an American. And I was obviously an American. But I went to a used bookstore, and when it opened, there was a line halfway across the block just waiting to get in. And when you got in, the lines for used books were 5 and 6 deep. And with Sudek, and I was really prepared to trade almost anything for either Sudek or Dritchkal prints. And I always thought Sudek was an amazing printer, not just an amazing photographer, but as a printer. You see the original prints, they're lush, they're rich with just silky, deep blacks and great tonal separation. So I thought I'd give away almost anything. Nobody would let go of a Sudek print. And there were 2 reasons. One is they knew what they had, and as a cultural heritage, he was precious. And the other of the things that they were scared of getting caught selling, that was probably the worst.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of encouraging, at least, that they thought that it was a cultural heritage object and wanted to hold on to it, right?
Yeah, I thought it was great, although disappointing.
And one another reason that people are talking about Sudek a little bit right now, and I think Judah Palm was just promoting him, is that he did a lot of work also just in his house, in his studio, out the studio window, the garden right outside of his studio. So being limited to your subject matter right now is something that a lot of people are struggling with, and people are looking a little bit to him for inspiration. Unfortunately, the only time I went to Prague for the one time, I was determined to see a bunch of things. I wish I had seen his studio, but I don't know if it was open then. It certainly wasn't on the Saturday I was there, but that's a pilgrimage I'd like to make, because they've got his studio open and you can go in and, they've got lots of prints to see and things like that. So if you're making it to Czech Republic, I highly recommend it.
Bring big pockets.
Yeah. So got a couple more minutes, and like I said, one reason is Zoom keeps it a limit to 40 minutes on these free accounts, so that's another reason to keep it short. But I also just thought it'd be nice to come in, talk about something, and get out. Anyone else have something you want to talk about related to this work?
I
Yeah,
have.
go.
Oh, hi, Kai. Thank you. That's so inspiring. Mike, was wondering if you could explain better the exposure issue in the 2 settings, because it really is like the kind of seems like a paramount example of having incredible tonal ranges and shadow detail and highlight detail, that it's really that kind of exploiting the power of black and white photography for dealing with light. So were there 2 settings for shutter speed? Could you talk a little bit more technically about what was going on?
Well, if you look at the way the lens swings across, right? So it's only exposing a little portion of the film as it swings across there. And and the way that works is it has 2 speeds that it would swing across, a slower pan across and then a faster. And those were the 2 shutter speeds. Now, I don't know on the lens, from the technical information I look up, I'm not sure if there were how many f-stops were on the lens, but that would be the only other exposure control. So I'm imagining it was probably something like, half a second or 15th of a second, and then probably a fast like 60th of a second. And of course, you could have just changed the film, but yeah, it's very limited in what you can control.
Can't tell from the advertisement the lens has any aperture on it.
Yeah, I looked for that earlier, because they talk a lot about how great the lens is and the quality of it, but they don't mention any f-stops. I'm looking at it again right now. Yeah, no, they just say quality focal length, blah, 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 blah. It weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces, but yeah, nothing else other than that, unfortunately.
Thank you.
But from the Russian one I've got had no f-stop changes and only had like 4 speeds, so you could just have.
Was that the FT2?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm poking around because I thought I had one around here somewhere.
Is the Russian one the panorama?
It's a
or the Goodies one? Sorry, is it the Good Horizon? Is it called Horizon? The one you have?
Dennis is looking for his copy. If he finds it,
okay.
4 minutes.
I think it was actually made as an artillery camera or something. Like it was designed to photograph artillery barrages, or I can't remember.
Good use.
There was a photographer in Moscow I was friends with who has since passed away, named an American guy named John Raynard, who did some really nice stuff with a Russian panoramic camera.
On what? What's
If
his
you
name?
want to look him up, John Raynard. He was photographing kind of a drug addiction and HIV, but also just that kind of transition from communism to capitalism in the 90s. He was
Michael Spano photographed with one of those too for a long time, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Michael Spanner did one with that, and he also did the multiple exposure ones with the multiple lenses.
But I remember like that one on the subway was where it actually
Yeah.
doesn't. I used to think it went from horizontal to vertical in the same image,
No, it just
although it
time-
doesn't. But that
time-
was one of the ones I always thought about when I was photographing.
Yeah, exactly the same sort of time sweep idea.
Dennis, when is your book? Can you say anything about your book of the panoramic photos?
Oh, who knows what's going on the way things are now? I mean, I finished all the prints. I spent like the last 11 months making prints, making all the final prints. But you know, who knows with everything that's going on when we'll be able to get to digitize them and get things out. But
Well, we've got 3 minutes left, so before we get kicked off. So if anyone else,
I think I have a question. Well, it's not a direct question, but maybe you can speak to these photographs. Seem to me to be different from Sudek's other photographs that are just much more like straight photography, 4x5, no distortion, and then these photographs are using that distortion sort of as a jumping off point for composing the image, and like that distortion is kind of the subject of the image, like the trees coming in from the side. Do you?
I mean, I just think he was a master, and so whatever the tool that he had was, he figured out how to use it to its best extent, right? And I do think one thing that differentiates a lot of these photographs from his other ones is there's a lot more people in these photographs, and that probably has something to do with the fact that he wasn't carrying this bulky thing. I mean, this thing weighs 2 pounds, but you could hold it in your hand, so he probably enabled him to do stuff that he wasn't able to do with all the other cameras, but he could still make contact prints. He never made enlargements. He was always making contact prints. Working as in the darkroom with one arm probably made it a lot easier too to work that way.
Now, I'm not sure, Kai, because a lot of his prints are 4.5 view camera. They're small.
Right,
So-
but and that's what I'm saying. Like he used multiple plate cameras, with different film sizes. But all of the reproductions I've heard of him making are all just contact prints, not making enlargements.
Right.
So even with this panoramic camera, you could make contact prints of those, and like
yeah, most of the prints that I've seen, like I've been watching them at auctions here and there, and they're very small.
Yeah.
So I'm not
They
sure
look
the
like
camera
contact lenses.
size is that different between a 4.5.
Well, that one that in the heroic picture at the beginning, what looked like, I think it was bigger than 8x10. He had some big camera.
But as he got older, the cameras got smaller.
Yeah.
A lot.
So we'll probably get kicked off in about 1 minute. So in case we do, I just want to say thank you to everyone for showing up. And
Thank you, Kai. Amazing. Great.
I'm going to schedule one for next week, and I'll send out the same information so you guys hear about it and what the topic is. And I hope everyone can join up for that as well.